Well, welcome everybody to this presentation this afternoon. We're going to be talking about ALS research. This is session 2 of our Navigating ALS series. And this is mainly geared towards people who are newly diagnosed to give them kind of a set of knowledge, a foundational set of knowledge about research in the ALS world. And so we have a guest presenter who will introduce herself in a minute. But just a couple of reminders. We are recording this presentation, so we'll send out the recording to your email afterwards, so you can reference that later. The best view to view the presentation in is speaker view, and that option is usually at the top right of your screen if you're new to Zoom. The other thing I'll mention is that we'll keep everybody on mute so that we don't have any background noise throughout the presentation. But if you do have questions during the presentation at any point, you can use the chat feature, which is at the bottom of your screen. If you'll move your cursor around, you'll see a chat function, and you can enter questions in that chat box, and we'll address those at different points during the presentation. So with that said, we thank you again for joining us today. And right now I'm going to pass it over to Linda, who will introduce our guest speaker.
Hello, everyone. Before we do that, I just wanted to give you a brief overview of what the ALS Association does and how we can help. The association is striving to create a world without ALS. Everything we do can be traced back to the version of no longer hearing of people being diagnosed with ALS. We want to discover treatments and a cure for ALS and to serve, advocate, and empower people affected by ALS to live their lives to the fullest. The next slide. The roles of Steve, Jennifer, Jordan, and myself are to help you meet a variety of needs, both tangible and emotional. We want to give you information, but we also want to give you hope. We want to inform you of your options and help you connect to resources that may benefit you in your journey. We want to empower you so you're able to make informed decisions. We want to give you information on managing the disease and a general overview of the progression, because we have found that no two people are the same and the progression of ALS can be unpredictable at times. Next, we have our guest speaker, Pam Kittrell. She has held many roles, which includes our former clinic coordinator for our weekly ALSA Multi-Disciplinary Clinics in San Antonio. Pam has worked in research with Dr. Jackson for nearly 18 years and currently serves on the NEALS Executive Board as the Clinical Research Coordinator Representative. We are happy that she's here today to present on research. Pam?
Thank you, Linda, and thank you to everybody for joining today. Basically, I'm going to do sort of a high-level look at research, what research is, and what how you might get involved in research. If there are specifics, we can sort of talk about that, or I'm happy to entertain questions individually. You'll have my email and other ways to reach me, and I'll stop a couple times during the presentation. So first of all, what really is the role of research? Everything that we dispense from a pharmacy in the form of drugs, or sometimes even devices from pharmacies, everything we use in terms of devices we might use to help us take care of ourselves, everything that we do, procedures that we perform, have really been tested. They've either been tested by accident. We learned that something worked by accident. We learned by anecdote. In other words, people started reporting that some change was occurring or that something was happening with a medication or a treatment that they were doing, and it seemed to make things better. Formal methods of research are what we're going to talk about a little bit more in detail. And of course, by time. We always look at things over time and the kind of difference we made. And I think that what's been happening with COVID is a really good example of how the research in COVID has changed over the last 2 years, and it's changed rapidly and dramatically because of how quickly this virus has changed. we really, when we're looking at treating people either with drugs or devices, we really want to be able to show that what we do either makes a difference, it improves care and outcome, but also it's safe. And that's a primary concern always. And you'll hear that from the FDA and other places. We want to make sure that what we're doing and providing and giving and prescribing are safe for our patients. Next slide, please. So there are some basic steps for clinical trials next. So there's the preclinical phase, and this is really a laboratory phase where we're looking at animals and cells, and we don't move forward to evaluate these in humans until all those preclinical lab tests are done. Those are safety tests, they're often tolerability tests, and that could take a couple years. The next phase is called the clinical phase, and this is when we actually start giving the drug to humans. And it's done in sort of 3 phases, and it involves increasing numbers of patients or people. The phase 1 study is looking really just at safety. What is the safe dose? How does that treatment affect the human body, chemically, physically? How should the treatment be given? Orally, by mouth, IV in the veins, on the skin, and then in what formulation? And that's usually about 20 to 100 healthy volunteers. These are people who do not have an illness. And this usually takes several months to get those kinds of treatments done. We're really looking for safe dose and how to get it in. Next slide. Then we go into phase 2 studies, and we start really looking a little bit at the efficacy or whether or not the drug works. Does it work to treat the disease or cure the condition? Does it slow the progress like in ALS? And this can involve several hundred people. These are much bigger trials and they last longer. We're always comparing drug to a placebo. In other words, we really want to be able to say, does this make a difference in terms of safety, tolerability, and then we begin to touch on whether or not it's effective. And this can take from anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. Then we go into phase 3 studies where we're really looking at the drug's effectiveness and really looking over time at whether or not the drug is effective, and also focusing on any sort of adverse reactions, continuing always to monitor safety, looking at blood work as well as any side effects. We want to know, is this treatment better than, the same as, or worse than the standard treatment or placebo? If there is no standard treatment, we're comparing to placebo or patients on placebo. And this is usually several hundred patients up, and it can be 500 to 1,000 sometimes in some really big studies. And this will take several years. Phase 4 studies really come after the drug has been approved by the FDA, and they're really looking at the drug's effectiveness, cost effectiveness, and any additional information on adverse studies. And during these late phase 3 and phase 4 studies, then the pharmaceutical companies or sponsors really have several objectives. They want to compare this drug with other drugs already on the market. They're looking at cost effectiveness of this drug therapy relative to other traditional and new therapies. And they want to monitor this drug's long-term effectiveness as well as the impact on a patient's quality of life. There's something new that we're hearing about a lot more in research. It's not brand new, but in our ALS community, it's gotten a lot of buzz and talk now. And these are expanded access programs, or EAPs. These apply to individuals who are not really eligible for clinical trials. In clinical trials, we have some very specific inclusion and exclusion criteria. In other words, there are criteria that will allow you to be in the trial or might eliminate you from being in a trial. And these may have to do with things like how long you've had the disease, other drugs you're on, whether or not you've got a certain level of breathing capacity or strength capacity. And so sometimes people don't qualify for clinical trials. And so EAPs came about for those individuals who want to participate, but who might not be eligible for whatever reason. In the case of EAPs, the study drug is provided by the drug company or the sponsor, whichever language we want to use. And then individual program sites really vary with availability. In San Antonio, we don't have any EAPs going on. Some other sites have more EAPs going on. EAPs are fairly complicated, and while this is a wonderful opportunity that was passed forward and we're working on it now, there are some significant costs to doing research financially. And so it has to actually go through an FDA approval and IRB approval. It functions exactly like a research study. So all of those approvals are required. There's consents that need to be signed. Patients are treated as if they were a research subject. They have to come to certain visits. We have to be accountable for study drug. Usually there's a limited number of participants in each of these EAPs. And really, right now, some of the funding challenges are the biggest issues, and they haven't quite worked out the rollout for this for individual sites, because every investigator that takes on an EAP, you might take on an EAP for every single patient that you are enrolling. So it gets incredibly complicated, and they have not worked out all the details, but it is exciting. It is a great opportunity. We're still just looking at what's this going to look like and how are we going to be able to actually implement it at the local level. Go ahead, next slide. All right, so there's lots of different types of what we call evidence. And this, again, is something that we're seeing a lot of in the social media in terms of what is evidence. When we look at what is the very best evidence to show that something worked or didn't work, is we're looking at a large randomized, that means you might be assigned to one and somebody else is assigned to something else, like rolling dice, double blind, you don't know and we don't know, placebo, which means there's some people on drugs and people who are not, controlled trial. That's the best evidence. We can actually say, look, we looked at this drug head to head and people either did better or didn't do better. And so, and we've controlled, what we call controlled for a lot of those variables. Small randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trials are sort of the next best level of evidence, because again, we're looking at controlling the variables or controlling those things that might make a study positive or negative or not get the best result. A large case series where we're going in and just looking back at many, many charts or looking back at a series of events in different patients' lives. And those can be very helpful because we can see a trend or a pattern. Animal studies can also be a fairly decent type of evidence, but we also know that what happens in the animal world and at the cellular level doesn't always translate to the human level. So while many times a drug might work in the lab or in the cell or in an animal, it doesn't translate into humans. If you're looking at just one or a few cases, those we call anecdotal evidence. We might say, boy, we gave this woman this drug and she did great. Well, if we can't do that repeatedly with a number of people, we can't really say that that drug made a difference. And then there's the hypothetical situation where we think it'll work based on the method of action. This is why we believe this drug might work. It's actually not a great form of evidence or not a great way to look at and say this might work for our patients, but it's often where research starts, is we say, look, this might work, so let's give it a try. Okay, any questions so far?
No, I don't see we have any.
Okay, go ahead. So one of the questions we always get asked are, what are the actual proven treatments for ALS? And interestingly enough, it's not necessarily drugs. Non-invasive ventilation or Bipaps or trilogies or whatever kind of device a person might have are pieces of equipment that can be used. Of course, we know about CPAPs that get used for people who have sleep apnea, for example. But in ALS, we use something that's called a Bipap or a non-invasive ventilation. When respiratory status changes or when it becomes difficult to breathe or hard to get a deep breath or don't feel like you're able to get deep breath, we often will prescribe something called non-invasive ventilation. It can be used overnight, can be used during the day. And what we know about this is that this particular device helps to open up the lungs, helps keep that alveoli full, and good oxygen exchange helps prevent pneumonia. And we know that these things really do make a difference in quality of life and how long our patients with ALS live. PEG tube is another thing we talk about, or a feeding tube. A lot of people have sort of horror stories and lots of bad feelings about feeding tubes, but we really see the feeding tube, just like the non-invasive ventilation, as a tool. You want to use all the tools in your toolbox. If you're building a shelf and all you have is paint and a few nails, that may or may not get that shelf put together. But if you have the wood and the saw and the screws and the screwdriver and the sanders, you put all that together to build that shelf. And we do the same thing. The PEG tube can be a way to get fluids. It can be a way to get nutrition. It can be a way to get pills in. And we see that particularly with patients who have bulbar symptoms or bulbar symptom onset, the PEG tube is a great therapy device to help keep good nutritional levels. And we know that that can help extend life as well. Riluzole has been around for 25 or 30 years now, and that is one medication. It's a pill that's taken a couple times a day. And we know that that also tends to slow disease and extend life expectancy a little bit. Edaravone is the new kid on the block, been around for about 3 years. That is an infusion. I get an infusion 2 weeks out of every month, and then have usually 10 days, 2 weeks off. Another medication that actually was approved by the FDA after research was done on it in Japan, which is a little bit unusual because the FDA almost always requires research to have been done in the United States to get approval, but they did give approval for this based on the results of some testing that was done in Japan. The other thing that seems to make a big difference in ALS patients is something called multidisciplinary clinics. And there's a citation there, AAN guidelines, that lists a lot of different things that can be looked at in terms of things that make a difference in ALS. And they found that in this review of the literature that actually people who went to multidisciplinary clinics did better. They, when you get to have one-stop shopping, when you can see respiratory therapies, speech therapy, nutrition, physical therapy, occupational therapy, and the doctor and the nurses and the research staff, if you see everybody at one time, it helps get a really complete picture of our patients and their families, and gives the opportunity to have sort of that expert care all in one place. So these are the sort of 5 things that we know do make a difference in ALS. So what's the role of research in ALS? Well, we know that ALS is an orphan disease, and an orphan disease is a disease that is so rare that typically the big pharmaceutical companies, go ahead, are the ones, they don't adopt these diseases because there's really little financial incentive in the private sector. It costs billions of dollars to bring a drug to market nowadays. And so you want to be able to have some sort of compensation or a return on your investment, if you would. And that's why sometimes other drugs will just get gangbusters and go to town, because we know it can reach hundreds of thousands of people as opposed to 50,000 people. And it unfortunately, that's sort of where it is. There are limited effective drug treatment options in orphan diseases, and so that's important for ALS. Current focus has always been on treating symptoms as well as drug treatments to slow the disease progress. And we also know that with our ALS, go ahead, we're looking to sometimes change the standard of care. This happened with, for example, with the Trilogy devices. We knew that patients who got on a breathing device did better, but sometimes the different insurance companies weren't buying it because it wasn't a traditional pulmonary disease. It was a neurologic disease that had lung problems associated with it. And so a lot of research was done that actually made a difference and impacted how things were covered. So go ahead. So there are some research areas happening in ALS, which is, it's a very exciting time, actually. I've been at this about 18 years, and this is one of the, it's just been an explosion in the last 10 of research opportunities. We're looking at assistive technology like speech devices, as well as things that might robotic type devices. We're looking at biomarkers in ALS. How is the blood of ALS patients similar? How do we find certain chemicals? Do we find certain patterns in the DNA, that kind of thing? Clinical studies, of course, which is where you're taking a drug or a device and you're treating people with it to see if it makes a difference. Cognitive studies have gotten very big in ALS, studies of how does the brain function, how does the brain work, and how is thinking changed. Disease mechanisms, why do we think people get ALS and what's actually happening in the body, as well as disease models, of course, drug development, looking at environmental factors, and we have had for many years. Gene therapy, can we possibly alter the genes? And this is particularly important in people who have the genetic form of ALS, which is about 10% of the patients with ALS do have some genetic component. The genetics of ALS is also very exciting. We used to think there were one or two things that impacted. Now we know there's probably in the neighborhood of 40 or more genes that seem to impact ALS. Nanotechnology, natural history studies, which are very important. I think sometimes people think, well, it doesn't really, you know, we're just looking at people over time. How can that make a difference? But it really does, because it gives us better and better pictures of our people and what the disease looks like. How does it progress? Are there certain points that a certain type of intervention might be better? Should we start this drug sooner versus later? All those kinds of pieces. Precision medicine, which is a very exciting time in medicine, where we're looking at each person individually and saying, okay, given this person's body makeup and their pre-existing conditions and everything else, what kinds of things should we be using to treat these patients? And then, of course, stem cells, which is always everybody's very exciting. Unfortunately, we haven't seen a lot in that area that's been positive, but there's always great hope because it continues to be used in many areas of medicine. Next slide. So the question always is, who's doing this research? I mean, who's doing it? Well, if you go to any of these sites, clinical trials, NINS, NCAM, which is a complementary and alternative medication, the National ALS Registry and Biorepository are under CDC and .gov. The military does research, ALS.org does the research, the MDA does the research. Next slide. These are all areas you can go to look at what research is being done. NEALS, Patients Like Me, ALS Worldwide, I Am ALS, all of these different ones. The last two, ALS Untangled and Quack Watch, really look at alternative treatment claims. And sometimes in an effort to be helpful, people can say, you know, hey, well, I heard if you drink beet juice, that'll cure ALS. It's important to sort of look at, have any of these alternative treatments been looked at? And have they been studied in any way that might tell us that there actually could make a difference? And this is where ALS Untangled and Quack Watch can be very helpful, because they can really look at those places and those organizations that perhaps are not looking out for our best interest of our patient population. Go ahead. Any questions so far?
No, I don't see any in the chat.
Okay. So the next question then is, how do I get involved in research? Well, one of the first ways to get involved is basically with repositories. The ALS registry, the National ALS Registry, is a great way to get involved. They are looking at people all over the United States. And they really drill down and look at where you've lived, what kind of jobs you've had, things you might have been exposed to in your life or your work, eating habits, exercise, all those kinds of things. And you can go in and do something as simple as sign up, and that tells us that we have another individual living in South Texas with ALS, because as we all know, we've been inundated with numbers for the last couple of years as well, and we know numbers make a difference. So if we know that we've got 5,000 or 15,000 or 55,000, when we're going to Congress or when we're going to plead our case with an insurance company, if we can really say, look, this many people are affected by this. It's not one or two, it's a large number. And so repositories can be very helpful in terms of giving us information over time. And this is similar to longitudinal studies. Those longitudinal studies are a little bit more structured, but you can also do a longitudinal study where you basically consent to allow us to look at your ALS treatments over time. And we're a part of one of those studies, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Also, there are bankings where you can give blood samples for DNA repositories, different ways. Some people can give spit or skin. There's lots of ways to contribute to the large body of research that's being done in ALS without being in a clinical trial per se. Of course, clinical trials, which is where you might come in and be treated with a medication, that's one way to be involved in research. There's something called the Clinical Research Learning Institute, which is part of the NEALS organization, which is actually a really wonderful program to learn about clinical research and therapy development, and then certify research ambassadors. And these research ambassadors have, back in the day when we did these kind of things, they went to Washington to advocate, and they can do things locally to advocate. It's a really great opportunity, and there's a link there if you're interested, or I can send you more information about it. ALS and COVID is also an interesting area. Through July of 2022, the COVID registry ALS registry is really following our ALS population and how COVID has impacted them. There are a couple of links there where you can see, again, it's basically going in and logging in information about whether or not you've been vaccinated, whether or not you've had the disease, what kinds of treatments you might have had. And this is actually also very important. We know our ALS families and our ALS patients are at particularly high risk if they were to get COVID, because of the huge respiratory component as well as the blood clotting issues that are associated with the COVID or SARS-19 disease. So if you have had or have not had, and you're interested in participating, those are those links to get in and share that information. Next slide. So what are we doing here? Here at UT, we're involved in several studies. Starting from the bottom, we're in the National ALS Registry Biorepository. I'm happy to share that information with anybody. I can send you the link. The Healy platform, which is a large study that we're a part of, is currently not enrolling. They had fully enrolled all 4 of their first regimens. They're rolling out a 5th regimen, and a 6th one is coming shortly, but right now we're not enrolling anybody because they're not open to enrollment to any of the regimens at this moment. And that is a treatment. There's a liquid, a pill, a capsule, a shot, and those have all been closed. The next one is an infusion, which right now we're not a part of, and then a pill is following, I believe. The Create Capture is one of those longitudinal studies where you would agree to share your medical records that relate to ALS only, not your overall medical record, but Dr. Jackson has a formula or format that she uses when she enters information into your EPIC medical record. And that information is pulled out periodically to share that information about how people are being treated in terms of medications or physical therapy, occupational therapy, PEG tubes, those kinds of things. The BIGS Brain Bank, Biobank, and Biorepository is actually, it's a few years old. It's related to the BIGS is the Alzheimer's program here, but they brought with them a really wonderful opportunity for us to be able to have access to their brain bank and their biobank and their biorepository. Sometimes our families have wanted to be able to contribute at the end and either leave their brain or their body to research for ALS and other issues. And so we now have that ability here in San Antonio, which we did not before a couple of years ago. And it really is an incredible gift to be able to share that information after someone has passed. And the good thing about the BIGS group is that everything they find after they have done the analysis, they share with the family. And that's really an important piece of that. Next slide, please. So there are lots of clinical trial sites in Texas. We're not the only one doing research. The Austin Neuromuscular Center is, Houston, a South Texas VA clinic, Texas Neurology, Texas Tech out in El Paso, UT, that's us, San Antonio, and Southwestern. So if you live in the San Antonio area, or you want to explore what some of these other trial sites have available, because we're all different. We all have different staffing, we all have different protocols that we have been approved for. And so if you're interested in something, I'm always happy to have people reach out to me, and I can either connect you with the people in these locations, or we can figure out how to get you hooked up to them to see if it might be possible for you to participate in something they're doing that we might not be doing, and vice versa. Next slide. So this slide is an interesting slide. This basically tells you, if you look at the United States, what kind of active recruiting studies, research studies are going on across the United States. And you can see that in the United States right now, there's about 91 ALS research studies that are either active and or recruiting subjects. Worldwide, that number is about 218. So if you're looking specific, some people do go overseas to do some treatments, and that's is an option too, that if you have the means or the connections, that's a possibility. But you can see that that's where we are right now. This is the most recent clip that I got from clinicaltrials.gov, which is the main source of information. So you can see that there's about 16 different sites going on in the Texas area, 1 in Louisiana, 5 in Arkansas. I started trying to look at what's close to us. A lot goes on the coast, as you can see, the East Coast and the West Coast. They have some pretty big, and they often have really large research entities where they have everything from cellular research going on all the way through clinical trials and through that entire lifespan. Next slide. I think it's important to look at this in the context of 8 years ago. You see these numbers are quite different. Much of this, or almost all of this, has to do with the fact that there was just an explosion of research that came about after the Ice Bucket Challenge. The Ice Bucket Challenge just increased awareness phenomenally of ALS, but also provided funding and jumping off points for people. So when you're thinking about 2022 compared to 2014, you see the difference and how much farther we've come in terms of what kind of clinical trials are out there and available. Next slide. If you look at all categories, and that means research studies that are in the formulation period all the way through research studies that are closed, all right? You're looking at the whole broad spectrum of research in ALS. That's also a very telling number, 414 in the United States and 842 worldwide. If you go to the next slide, which again is a comparison from 2014 to now, this just shows a shot of where all these are going on. in the world, which I think is always interesting to see where is research happening. So if you're thinking about going somewhere else, go ahead to the next slide, sorry. I've got kind of slow uptake here, I apologize. If you're thinking about going somewhere else for research, there's some things that you really should consider. You want to look at the inclusion exclusion criteria. In other words, it may have to do with where you live. Sometimes they want people who live very proximate or very close to the study site. If some studies are familial versus sporadic onset of the disease. Time from onset of symptoms has become increasingly important because we're really looking at when did the symptoms first start. Breathing status, whether or not someone's on riluzole or radicava, doesn't mean you'll be excluded, but we may want you to be on a stable dose of at least 30 days before you enroll in a study. If you're on any other experimental drugs, that may exclude you from being in a study, and if you're on any exclusionary drugs. The other thing to really think about is what we call travel costs, because there is there are some physical costs to travel, and as things progress, it may get harder and harder to travel over time. There's an emotional cost to traveling and a financial cost. It's important to think about that if you're thinking about participating in a study. Will the sponsor be covering any of those costs? Is there a place for you to stay? Or are you on your own to find a hotel? All those kinds of things are important if you're looking at research elsewhere. And you have to also think about the change over time. You may not feel like traveling in 6 months to a year in the same way that you feel like it now. And so we want to always be thinking about the long-term, cost-benefit ratio, if you want to talk about it that way, that you want to think about as a family. Next slide. There are some things that I call red flags, and these are 10 things to really be wary of in products or trials on the internet. If there is a large out-of-pocket cost, in other words, if they're saying, send us a check for $40,000 or Venmo me $10,000 and I'll get you in, big red flag. Most research studies are covered almost 100% by the sponsor. So it shouldn't be costing you money to participate. Advertising for multiple conditions with different causes, giving everybody's cured. If you have ingrown toenails, if you have psoriasis, if you have kidney disease, if you have ALS, this treatment will cure you. Big red flag. It doesn't work that way. If there's a lack of documented safety or scientific oversight by an established institution, it can be governmental or it can be another kind of agency, but somebody who is sort of the overseer, looking to make sure that this is being done safely and correctly, this procedure and this research. Lack of or limited informed consent process. You need to be informed when you're participating in research. A vague description of why it works, a vague description of what we call the intervention. If they can't really tell you why this drug works, another big red flag. Lack of a solid mechanism as to why it might work. If there's only a once and done, if they don't have any regularly measured outcomes to see, does this intervention make a difference, and how long does that difference last? You may feel stronger for 2 or 3 weeks or 4 or 5 months, but at what point does that then change? Or is it a once and done thing where you have one shot and you feel better, but then they don't do any follow-up? Use of unvalidated outcome measures. We do strength testing, we do questionnaires, we do breathing testing. We're looking at a number of things to say, look, did this really make a difference? And these have all been validated by other research studies in the past. In other words, there's something we can trust. If there's vague or no plan to present the outcomes in any kind of peer-reviewed format, we hear a lot about peer review, and that's because anybody can say anything about their research. But unless it's really been reviewed and looked at for its quality, for its accuracy, for its ability to be reproduced, we tend to look at those kinds of vague outcomes as not necessarily accurate or very real. And also, if the investigators or the leaders of this product or trial have no record of any kind of presentation or publication in the field, it's a little bit suspicious, and it's important to sort of be wary of these kinds of things. People want so much to find a cure, and we've all been looking for a cure for so long. It's easy to get caught up in something that might not be really legitimate and could be very costly, either financially or physically, safety wise. Next. It's also important, I think, to remember that there really is a global effort going on to find a cure. This is so important because every country has slightly different ways of how they do research and how they can confirm that something is effective. And so we really do rely on other places to share their information with us. I know sometimes it's hard because something really exciting will come out of Australia. They'll say, wow, this really shows this was working. And people start emailing me or calling me and saying, hey, when can we get that drug? And then I go in and look at it and I realize, oh, they just finished the animal model. So we're not even anywhere near a human testing. But it is important to remember that we do share when you go to international meetings, you learn a lot about what's happening elsewhere. And there's a lot of excitement going forward, trying to make a difference in the families and the patients living with ALS. Next slide. Any questions at this point?
No, I don't see any questions. You always do a great job of covering all this information.
Okay, well, next. So anyway, I want to thank Dr. Jackson and the 8th floor Mark Neurology staff. They are wonderful to work with, and the ALS Association UT Health team. These are some of the smartest people I've ever worked with and who are incredibly proactive with our patients and families. And I want to thank all our ALS families and research participants. I have learned more about ALS from our families and from our patients, and I am thankful for their generosity. And this is my information, actually only through the end of April, but we are working on finding somebody who will be following me in this position.
All right, well, I want to thank you, Pam, for presenting for us again. Like you said, there's so much going on in the world of research that it's one of the most frequently asked questions that we get, and it's really hard to stay on top of it. So I learn something new every time you present, and so thank you again for being here for us.
Thank you.
And our families.
Thank you.
And I want to thank everybody else for attending, and also to remind you that on March 8th, we have our next segment of employment and insurance. That's also another loaded topic with tons and tons of information. If you do come up with a question, please feel free to reach out to any one of us. If you have a question, we'll do our best to get an answer for you. And I also wanted to remind you that this is being recorded and it will be emailed to you. We'll be emailing out to you. Also, alstexas.org, if you want to go ahead and get connected with some other webinars, other connection groups that are being offered to you. That's great. There's lots of different things out there for you to get plugged into. I want your feedback. I don't know how that works, so so good luck. And once again, thank you for joining us.